In this exercise, you set up a RESTful development server on your computer named Json server from an npm package. It will be responsible for serving up the JSON data and the image files so that you can practice requesting those resources from your React app. We'll first need to set up a folder for the files that we will serve. You can create the folder however you like, whether through VS Code or a command line or through File Explorer or Finder. But first, let's think about where to put this folder. This folder will represent the server on the back end, which means that it's not a part of your React application code, which is the front end. We'll also be using Json server in the React Native course that follows this one. Thus, we will create the folder for json-server inside the nucamp folder directory. So we're not inside the 3-react or new campsite folder. We're in the nucamp folder. Now let me go inside this new json-server folder. Then I'll create a folder inside it named public. Next, we'll add some data. Navigate back to your nucamp folder, then inside your 3-react folder, then in the new campsite folder, in the public folder, then in the assets folder, where there should be a folder named images. Copy that whole folder with the images inside it to the json-server/public folder. Then in the learning portal, there's a file that you need to download from the page for this exercise, db.json. Download that file and move it to your json-server folder. So at the end of this, your file structure should look like this. In your nucamp folder directory, you should now have a json-server folder. Inside the json-server folder, you should now have the db.json file and a public folder. In your public folder, you should have the images folder, and in that should be all the images. Make sure that your folder and file structure matches what I've just demonstrated. Now go ahead and open a bash terminal in the json-server folder. Then refer to the written instructions for the command to install Json server globally and run that command. Next, we will start Json server. But first, it is very important that in bash, we are in this json-server folder when we start the server. Because we installed Json server globally, you can now technically start Json server from any folder. So you wouldn't get an error message if you ran Json server from a different folder. But if you use the command I'm about to give you in any folder other than the Json server folder, Json server won't be able to access the data in the db.json file, nor any content in the public folder. So when your React app tries to access those resources, it won't be able to. So please remember, for this bootcamp, you should only run Json server from inside this folder. If you are not 100% sure that you are in the Json server folder in bash, type pwd. This stands for present working directory, and it will show you your current location. It should look like this. Once you have confirmed that, use this command you see here to start a server. The -H flag sets the host. In this case, we're using 0.0.0.0 to make the server listen on all local IP addresses for requests, so that we can be sure that requests from the React app will go through. This --watch flag makes the Json server keep a watch on the db.json file and reload the data anytime that it's modified. This -p 3001 flag specifies that we want the server to run on port 3001. The default port number for Json server is 3000, but that's the same default port number that our React application runs on, so we have to override the default here. Then this -d 2000 number is to simulate a delay of 2000 milliseconds. It's like what we were doing with the setTimeout function before to simulate communicating with the server over the internet instead of just on our own computers. You will want to copy this entire command down somewhere that you can find easily, because we'll be using it again in future exercises. Then go ahead and press enter, and you should see that the JSON server starts up and declares all the resources that it has available and at what URLs. Look carefully at the screen here. Make sure that yours looks just like this. It should list these resources: campsites, comments, partners, promotions, feedback. If it doesn't, that means that it was not able to access the db.json file that you downloaded. So either that file is not in your JSON server folder, or you did not run this command from inside the JSON server folder. In your browser, try going to this homepage for the server, and you should just see an empty set of curly braces like this. In the terminal, you can see that JSON server is showing that it received a GET request, and it couldn't find any resources to serve there. The homepage is actually pointing at the public folder, and there aren't any files there, so it's showing an HTTP status code of 404, not found. If you were to go to any of these other paths, you should see that particular set of data from db.json show up in your browser. And in the terminal, JSON server is telling us here that this time the GET request for /campsites was successful, so the status code is 200. So if you have trouble with any of your data not being loaded into your app and you're trying to figure out why, you can check here in the terminal output from JSON server to make sure that it's not an issue with the server. Let me test quickly that I can access the other resources: comments, partners, and feedback. And as I mentioned, the contents of the public folder are available right at the top level of this path. You don't need to type public. You can just go straight to the images folder. Then if you want to access an image, just type its name. So as you can see, we can get to the logo.png image like this. To shut down JSON server if you need to, use Ctrl+C. There's just one last thing I'd like to do with you before we end this exercise, and that's to look at the contents of the db.json file. Let's just take a look real quick. As you can see, inside this file, at the top or root level, however you want to call it, we have what resembles a single JavaScript object literal with the curly braces. And this object has several properties: campsites, comments, partners, promotions, feedback. And all these properties are storing arrays of objects. So that's the structure of the file that we're working with. And notice that this looks a lot like JavaScript object literals, but it's not exactly the same. For example, the property identifiers here must all be inside double quotes, whereas for JavaScript objects, quotes can be used but are not required. As I mentioned, you'll be using JSON server for the remaining exercises in React, and you'll also be using it in your React Native course. So be sure that you have followed this exercise carefully to set it up, and that it works as shown. Don't forget to copy down the command to start JSON server, somewhere that you can find it easily. Finally, let me stress, during this bootcamp, you must always start JSON server from inside the JSON server folder. Remember this as you continue on.